So what are the impacts on victims of domestic abuse? And so we're looking at oppression. The biblical category would be oppression. So the lack of freedom to even have your own thoughts. Somebody who is telling you that you have to agree with my opinion or I'm going to be upset and I may become abusive. What happens to these women? Generally, what we see is confusion, complete confusion, because it doesn't usually happen overnight. It's a very gradual progression. I know in my case, he didn't just start abusing me right away or I would have gotten out immediately. But what happens is that there will be one incident here and there, and they could be far apart. I've had women tell me that he changed on the wedding day. He said, well, now you belong to me and you'll do what I say. So we have a woman on our board who said that's exactly what happened to her. He changed just like, it was like a light switch flipped on their wedding day. But he fooled her up until then. But for many women, it's confusion. It's very confusing. They don't know that it's abuse. They will say, something's wrong, but I can't really put my finger on it. And so they will come to you expressing extreme confusion more often than saying, I'm in an abusive marriage. They will not call it abuse. I certainly did not for 23 years, not until the very end. And we also know there's a book called Healing the, goodness gracious, I can't remember the exact name. But it basically it's called it's about healing after domestic abuse, healing the trauma of domestic violence. That's what it's called. And in that book, there was a study done out at the National Institute for PTSD Studies, and they said that women and children who have lived through domestic abuse are the highest number of traumatized people that they could identify. They were actually doing the studies on combat veterans, and then they found this other hidden group. And they said that over 80% had some form of post-traumatic stress, or nowadays we've come to call it complex post-traumatic stress. I have a friend, Chris Moles, who says, PTSD is just a one-time event, but he says complex post-traumatic stress, one bee sting might not kill you, but 1,000 will. And so it's just one small incident again and again over time, multiple incidences over time that create complex post-traumatic stress. And we know that people with complex post-traumatic stress have even more symptoms than just post-traumatic stress, which would include a loss of faith in God, starting to believe that their abusers are omnipotent and that they have more power than God. And then this really warped view of themselves as well. And so some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress are hypervigilance, brain fog, irritability, emotional instability, sleep disturbances, guilt, shame, dissociation, hopelessness. And so I have experienced all of that myself. And so what happens is when we're dealing with somebody in a situation where there's domestic abuse, a lot of times what will happen is we will think that she's the one with the problem because she comes, she can't put things together in a very logical fashion for you. It feels like she talks in circles. I've had victims come to me and say things like, well, we got into an argument. So what do? You start asking questions. And I said, well, what did the argument look like? And so she says, well, he came in from work and he had a rule that the trash cans had to be emptied every day before he got home from work. And when he got home from work, he saw that one of the trash cans had not been emptied. And so he kicked it across the room and he started slamming things around. And so to me, that's not an argument, but we, as a lot of times victims of abuse, are taught you have to take your part of the responsibility for what's happening. And so they're made to feel responsible for what's going on. So they may take more responsibility than belongs to them. And a lot of times too, they may be angry. They may be so traumatized that they just don't come across very well. So you need to understand that. I know that a lot of times I've had situations where I've gone into churches to talk to pastors, and I had a pastor say, well, he used to be abusive, and they had separated years earlier. He used to be abusive, and then he got saved, and now they got back together. But now that they're back together, I think she's the abusive one. Well, come to find out, I had really worked with her and found out that he was abusing the children. And yes, she was angry. But she was not the primary abuser. So understanding, knowing who the primary problem is, this is not a marital problem, as we'll get into in a little bit, but understanding who the primary aggressor is very important. And a lot of times you need to understand, is it coming from a motivation of I want to be in control, or is it coming from a motivation of trying to protect, or it's basically just reacting to what's happening to them? And so that's something too that our advocates at Call to Peace Ministries can do. We do have advocates across the country, and we can go in and work with them. And another advantage of having an advocate on your team is they can take all of the, sometimes it seems discombobulated, the testimony of a victim, and they can take it and give it to you in a more concise form, maybe 5 to 6 bullet points versus 30,000 words. And so another impact on victims is that their view of themselves is very warped. And then they often suffer from anxiety, depression. You'll see chronic health issues, autoimmune issues, migraine headaches, high blood pressure, hormonal and thyroid issues. I had a woman here who ended up in the emergency room. Her heart rate was 170. And she had extremely high blood pressure, only in her 30s. And her husband had to go out of the country for a while. And all of a sudden, here she was going and having all these medical tests. He left the country and all of her health issues cleared up. So that shows you how much this can impact even the health of a victim of domestic abuse. And so they have a warped view of God or a loss of faith, which to me is one of the saddest things. As a believer, it hurts my heart to see so many women losing their faith in God. A lot of times they lose it and then they have to reconstruct it. But some women, because their churches haven't responded well, will leave the church and their faith altogether. And that just breaks my heart. And I know it breaks God's heart. So what has been the church's response to domestic abuse? And so again, this is from my friend Chris Moles. The Heart of Domestic Abuse is his book, and he writes mostly about working with abusers themselves. But he had this passage in his book. He was invited to speak at a women's shelter on church responses to domestic abuse. And so he said that when he walked in, what struck me most about that meeting were the stories of abuse. These women had not endured a single abusive event, but in most cases, they had lived through decades of abusive, controlling, and violent behavior. But that was not the only thing they had in common. The majority of the women in the room were now either being disciplined or shunned by their own church. And sadly, I have seen that multiple times over the last 20-some years. I do believe that it's changing, it's getting better, but we need to understand it's because we don't understand the dynamics. And I'm so grateful that we're having this event today, because knowledge is definitely power, and people perish because of a lack of knowledge. So as you get the knowledge and begin to understand the dynamics of abuse, you're going to be much less likely to misunderstand it and to respond wrongly. And hey, I'm not here to say that this is a terrible thing, that people are out there willfully hurting members of their congregation. I don't believe that at all. I just think that domestic abuse is so insidious, so hidden and sneaky that anybody can be fooled. As an advocate, I have been fooled by abusers, or as a counselor, I have definitely been fooled by abusers. And so we have to be extremely cautious and wise in responding to this issue.